You're now listening to the Supply Chain Secrets Podcast, the ultimate insider's guide for all things ocean shipping. Presented by NYSHAX.
Hi everyone, good morning, maybe good middle of the night, depending on where you're coming in, tuning in from. But my name is Caroline Weaver. I am one of your hosts here at the Supply Chain Secrets Podcast, and with me is Lars Jensen. Lars, where in the world are you today?
I am in Samoa, in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, so for me this is a very good morning, early good morning to all of you.
Well, we appreciate you getting on basically in the middle of the night. I think it shows your commitment to the podcast and the content. I'm sure our viewers appreciate it. So today we're going to be doing a recap of TPM, and we're going to be sprinkling in some of our latest news articles and what we've been hearing in terms of geopolitical outlook. So we've got a few different topics. Lars, why don't you kick us off with what we ended up hearing at TPM by the end of the conference last week?
You can say where we started and where we ended up. We're not quite the same place. So let me just at least say how I see it. Because where we started the conference was I saw all stakeholders primarily come trying to get an answer to one question. How do we get rid of some of this uncertainty? What do we do, especially with the uncertainty around tariff? And when we got to the end of the TPM, there was basically a quiet resignation. We're not going to get any clarity around tariffs. Tariffs, we just have to acknowledge they change almost literally by the day these days, and there is no knowing where this will go. What will get implemented, what will then get postponed, there is just no predicting it. So even though everybody would like to have that one answered, nobody got that one answered. But at least there was the recognition that we're all in the same boat on that one. Then, of course, it was the kickoff of the usual annual contract negotiations, especially for Pacific. And with the risk of offending basically everyone that was involved in it, I would say that's basically no news. It was business as usual. Carriers come in with relatively high rate expectations, and over the course of TPM, rates get negotiated down. That is basically par for the course. That is what always happens at TPM, but at least the process is now up and running. On that sense, there's not really anything new. Then as the conference was proceeding, we went from one item being a small esoteric newsflash just before the conference to hitting the main stage already on day one. And that is the USTR 301. I sincerely wish it had a better name than that, but let's call it the USTR 301. People say it's the $1 million fee for Chinese vessels hitting the port. As became very, very clear also when you read into the details of it. The headline is somewhat misleading. It's a lot worse than that. It's a fee of basically $1 million for Chinese lines calling it. That would definitely get COSCO and WCO. It's a fee for Chinese-built vessels. That means if you've got Chinese-built vessels calling a U.S. port, or if you in your fleet portfolio have Chinese-built vessels, you might also pay $1 million per ship, also the non-Chinese-built ships coming into U.S. ports. If you have ships on order in China, you might pay up to $1.5 million also for the non-Chinese ships to call U.S. ports. And these are cumulated. So if you are basically COSCO or WSTL, this could be up to $3.5 million per vessel per port call. For everybody else, up to $2.5 million per vessel per port call. This is much larger than anything we've seen before. I'm actually in the process of building a small model on this one. And my preliminary numbers here are, if this is implemented the way it's suggested, that's an if. And if the carriers don't change anything, that's also an if. I'll get back to that in a second. This could likely cost to the tune of roughly $24 billion per year. If I spread that out over every single import and export box in the US, this is roughly $1,000 per FFE for all boxes. Now, adding $1,000 a box is unimaginable on the, for example, export trades on Pacific. That would just kill all the US ag exports. So chances are less of this will go on the exports, but more on this on the imports. And in many trades, this kind of fee is on the order of magnitude or larger than the freight rate itself, at least under normal circumstances. So a major impact, to put it mild. And keep in mind, it's per ship. So it doesn't matter whether you come with a 15,000 TEU ship into US East Coast, or if you come with, say, a 1,500 TEU ship coming up from South America, it's still that same $1 million fee that needs to be spread on the few boxes on the 1,500 TEU.
There's quite a lot of breaking news that seemed to happen when we were at the conference. Very interesting things to discuss afterwards.
Yeah, and the interesting thing was this one broke right as the conference started. So, and this was fortunate because on day one, we have Søren Toft, the CEO of MSC, world's largest container line. he was up for an interview on stage. This was the first question right out of the gate to him. If this is implemented, what will MSC do? Because clearly that's a good gauge for what the industry will do. And I happen to agree completely with the answer that Trump was given. Because he would see, well, if this is the case, you would see carriers sharply reduce the amount of port calls coming into the U.S. If I'm calling multiple ports and I have to pay $1 million per port call, I'm going to reduce port calls. And that means I'm going to reduce port calls to the smallest ports. Plus, the example he gave was, instead of calling both, for example, Los Angeles and Oakland, a lot of the services might only call Los Angeles. And from the way I see it, that would mean congestion problems in the large ports because they get a lot more cargo. And you would have issues with exporters from the smaller ports. Oakland, for example, is a large export port, especially for ag exporters. And they would then have to truck all their stuff down to Los Angeles. If you look at the East Coast, it's fairly common that most, especially transatlantic or Asia-US East Coast services, call 3 to 4 ports. Easily also be cut to 1 or maybe 2. That would cause, for example, a major fight between, are we going to call Savannah or are we going to call Charleston? Those kinds of considerations. So if this is implemented, it will have a major impact on all U.S. importers.
Yeah, I think in the short term you'd see a massive surge in congestion. But as I was thinking through this, do you think there would be some level of maybe like the larger vessels, larger carriers would be going into the bigger ports, and then some of the smaller carriers might be going into those smaller ports that are along the coast?
But there is a twist here. The larger carriers, they will definitely try to upscale the vessel. They can't upscale the ones going into U.S. East Coast. They're running big ships there. But there is an option to upscale some of the vessels coming into U.S. West Coast, again, to mitigate the unit cost impact. So I would definitely expect to have some of that. For the smaller carriers, this becomes really interesting. Because keep in mind, the fee is per ship. And there are very likely also some of the smaller carriers that have vessels that might be, say, 15, 20 years old, were originally built in China. So some of these smaller carriers also be subject to the $1 million fees. And that would be an extraordinary burden. This could drive some of those smaller niche carriers out of the U.S. market. If you're wondering about what a U.S. flag carrier such as Matson, as far as I see, as I understand, Matson does have on charter, I think, 1 or 2 vessels that were built in China originally. So you can say technically Matson would also be subject to these fees. However, there's also a provision in there. If you are operating U.S.-built ships, you can sort of get out of jail free card, so to speak, at least proverbially speaking, for some of your Chinese-built ships. So Matson goes home free. But for a lot of these small niche carriers that come into the U.S., given how prevalent it is in the industry to use Chinese-built ships, this could very well have the effect of driving some of the smaller niche carriers out of the market and, as a consequence, reduce competition on freight in and out of the U.S.
Yeah, and we've already seen a lot of consolidation in the ocean carriers over the past few decades, so having more would definitely not serve the end consumer, the shippers, very well, reducing the amount of options that you have. I think
Certainly
what we're talking about now also plays nicely into the advice that we gave to shippers going into TPM, diversifying your portfolio in terms of what you have available to book, what your allocations are, having multiple port options, because as the Gemini Alliance is getting sorted, you're going to have changes in how they are routing based on, how profitable, how operationally feasible it is for them. So I think what we're talking about now is another example of you want to make sure that you have that diversity in your portfolio.
Have the diversity, and on the shipper side, making sure you have a very good idea of how do I rapidly change my supply chain. Because the good old ones say, fine, I'm planning my supply chain, this is what I'm going to do for the next 12 months. Yeah, do that by all means. But there's no guarantee that plan will hold up for very long. If it's not the USTR 301, it might be new tariffs. It be any number of these geopolitical issues that are boiling over right now that you have to take into account. And maybe now that I mentioned geopolitics, the one thing we haven't talked about, and interestingly enough, what there was not a lot of talk about at TPM, was the Red Sea crisis. We basically become conditioned that, it's just there, it's kind of background noise. But let's not forget, the Red Sea crisis is the only thing keeping overcapacity again from overwhelming this industry. And there was hope a couple of months ago that there was light at the end of the tunnel with the ceasefire deal. But the latest news is that unless something dramatically changes, Houthis have basically said they're going to start shooting the ships again tomorrow. They issued an ultimatum back on Friday, 4-day ultimatum. Now, mind you, The Houthis said when the Israel-Palestinian ceasefire started in Gaza back in January, the Houthis respect that ceasefire as well when it came to ships. The Houthis have been true to their word on that one. So on Friday, the ultimatum they gave was that unless Israel restarts humanitarian aid shipments into Gaza, the Houthis will start shooting at ships again, starting on Tuesday. Is there a likelihood that the Houthis will get what they asked for? Seems not. The latest news flash I saw was that Israel is not restarting humanitarian shipments. Instead, they now also cut the electricity power supply to Gaza as of yesterday. As things stand, the situation in the Red Sea is likely going to go back to what has been normal for more than a year as of tomorrow. Now, it's also important in this context to note that even before the ceasefire, the Houthis have only attacked, I think it was 2 or 3 times in the last couple of months before that. I don't think that's because the Houthis were getting soft. It's simply a matter of all of the shipping interests that are potential targets. They had already diverted around Africa. The ships that did go through the Red Sea, and there definitely are ships that do that, are typically from shipping lines or ships associated with countries that the Houthis are just not targeting. That also means we are likely looking months into the future before there's any hope of the shipping lines reverting to a path through the Red Sea again. So for everybody that planned, we're still going to have tight supply and demand. Yes, that will prevail. And this is now also exceedingly likely to continue also into the peak season. And that also means peak season is likely to start early again, just like we saw last year. So we should prepare for that one to start to kick off in something like 6 to 7 weeks from now.
All right, good to know. Mark your calendars, everyone. I wanted to shift gears a little bit into talking about the BlackRock deal and how MSC is now the owner of the most terminals in the world. Do you mind elaborating a bit on how that happened, maybe why that happened and what the impact might be?
Yeah, the interesting thing was that everybody had their eyes locked on the geopolitical issue with the U.S. wanting to take over the Panama Canal all of a sudden, and all the discussion around the alleged Chinese interference in canal operations. There are no Chinese canal interference in the canal operations, but this is politics and fact seems to matter less. So all eyes were on the 2 Hutchinson-operated terminals that are on either end of the canal. And when the news first broke, what most people first saw was that the 2 Hutchinson terminals had been sold, which was, I would say, not really a major surprise. It would solve also the political issue, but very quickly then became apparent was this is not just the 2 terminals. These are 45 Hutchinson-operated terminals across 23 countries. It's basically all of the Hutchinson terminals outside of China and Hong Kong. They still keep China and Hong Kong. This is a major deal, to put it mildly, and it's bought by a consortium between BlackRock and TIL, which is MSC's terminal operating arm. And as far as I've been able to ascertain and not been able to confirm, but what I've seen so far is that it's roughly a 50-50 split between BlackRock and TIL. What this also means is that MSC, with this deal, essentially becomes the world's largest container terminal operator, which significantly improves MSC's competitive positioning as a global carrier. Now, of course, the issue is always you can buy stuff, can you run it? I would assume MSC can run it and that they can improve it. So let's take that one as an assumption. But that also means that MSC and the network now has much better operational control of a large amount of additional nodes in their network. That gives them better vertical integration, should give them better ability to operationally manage their costs, and should, in theory, also allow them the opportunity to further improve their schedule reliability, given they control more of the terminals on the round trip. So from a container shipping perspective, this is definitely significant news, and it leaves the market in a situation where there are what appears to be no real path forward for any new major acquisitions and mergers over in the terminal space, which solidifies that market for quite a while. So that was on the container carrier side. Then there is the geopolitical side of it, which it has nothing really to do with MSC, but everything to do with the China Belt and Road. Because we've been looking at the China Belt and Road strategy for 10, 15 years now, with China increasingly creating footprints all over the world. So what I think is the big question that I don't think anyone has an answer to right now is, what is China getting in return? Yes, I know Hutchinson is not a Chinese state entity, it's privately owned, but in China and by extension also Hong Kong, politically we cannot see them as completely detached from each other. And I cannot see a situation where the Chinese government would be happy with this deal without getting something else in return somewhere else. It might not be a business deal, it might be political concessions, we don't know, but I would be very confident that there is a quid pro quo somewhere in this deal.
While you were gone, we had a couple questions come in, so I want to make sure that we address them. So the first one here is from Josefina. So she said, Lars, I heard of potential staffing shortages at U.S. Customs. Anything to look out for there?
Yes, indeed. And you can say that's actually a hypothesis that I was launching over at the TPM, because the way I see this one is every single U.S. agency is getting impacted by DOGE, and they haven't been with all of them. Those haven't been at CBP yet, Customs and Border Protection. I cannot see a scenario where they're going to fire a lot of Border Patrol agents in uniforms down by the border. That would not fit with the current administration's political view on the world, but I would not rule out that people with desk jobs might not necessarily be spared. Even if they are, I would also assume with the mass firings that's going on in the federal jobs, a lot of people are looking for alternative jobs. So I can easily see a situation where CBP at some point later this year gets short-staffed. Add to this the whiplash developments in tariffs coming on and off, which adds to the workload to CBP. So I can easily see a situation later this year where we might have bottlenecks getting cargo customs cleared. If that's the case, this is going to create bottlenecks, not just at the seaports, also at the airports and also at the land borders.
All right, good to keep in mind. We have another question here from Matt. So with Greenland in the news, I was curious how Lars views Arctic shipping lanes as a possibility in the medium to long term, and whether they'd be commercially viable / rival current routes.
The first thing is short to medium term, and here I'm thinking at least the next 10 to 20 years. They are not all that relevant. I was actually involved in some projects right before the pandemic on this, because there was a lot of hype around the Northeast Passage going north around Siberia, where if you look at a map, yeah, it looks like a no-brainer, but when you look at reality, there was a lot more hype than actual cargo being moved. Sure, every year there was record-breaking amounts of cargo moving the Northeast corridor. First of all, a lot of that was not transit cargo from Asia to Europe. It was raw material being exported from Siberia itself. And the actual freight volumes we're talking are extremely tiny, basically a tiny blip. And what I found when I looked into it, this was likely being hyped more by Russia as a way to get someone to invest in port infrastructure in Siberia, because Russia needs that to build out their military bases in the islands north of Siberia. Viability of these shipping lanes, you are talking 20, 30 years plus down the lines. Greenland being a vital node in Arctic shipping, you're going to have massive cargo from Asia coming past Greenland, going both US and Europe. It's not going to be in our lifetime. That's going to be 30, 40 years at least down the line before we are looking at that scenario realistically.
All right, that's some good insight. And we have another question here. So, Lars, you spoke to MSC and BlackRock. What do you make of the new USA and CMA CGM infrastructure deal?
The deal that was announced, that was basically CMA CGM CEO Sade, who was in the White House announcing this deal. I see a couple of things in it. If you look at the business side of it first, it's a $20 billion investment in various logistics infrastructure in the US. So it's investments in ports and terminals. There was an air cargo hub. There are warehouses, logistics facilities, and then an increase in their US flag fleet. Now, when it comes to the investment in infrastructure, I cannot know, of course, but I would assume many of these investments are investments that CMA would have done regardless of who was sitting in the White House, regardless of what the U.S. politics is. They would be doing these investments because that is what they see is needed to service their customers with logistics solutions going forward. I mean, everyone is investing billions of dollars into infrastructure upgrades in the U.S. every single year. Not that this is to denigrate the $20 billion investment. It's absolutely good for logistics in the U.S. I just don't necessarily see that this has been spurred on by any political agenda whatsoever. What CMA, of course, has done very deftly here is we have to acknowledge we live in a reality where the U.S. president seems to relish in people telling them that they are sort of doing stuff for America because of his agenda. And that's fine. That political game can be played. I just don't see that CMA is doing this just because of the Trump administration. I think they would have done most of this anyhow. The one thing that is absolutely new is to upscale from 10 to 30 U.S. flag vessels. That is clearly playing into this whole agenda that's underlying the USTR 301. And actually, there was a Ships for America Act back in December as well. Now, it operates under CMA's APL arm, so APL being the old American President Lines, they have 10 U.S. flagships. Now, keep in mind, in order to have U.S. flagships, they don't have to be built in the U.S. There's a distinction. You can be U.S. flag, but it can be built abroad. If you want to be a Jones Act carrier, then it also has to be built in the US. And I think some tends to get these two confused. The APL ships are also not the Jones Act ships. Matson has Jones Act ships, for example. So how is CMA going to accomplish this? I think the main part of getting 20 new ships in addition to the 10 is likely going to be reflagging ships in. That is the easiest part of it. It is not completely easy. Of course, it's more expensive to operate a US flag, but I was about to say that's just money. That can be done. The challenge will be, does the US have enough mariners available to crew these ships? Because that's a vital part of having a US flag. That is having US mariners running those ships. Then, at least it appeared to me that CMA was kind of promising that at least some of these ships might also be built in the US. In that case, it's not going to be all 20. I think CMA was saying it's going to happen within 4 years. As far as I recall, Exxon right now has some of the largest ships ever built, container ships that is, ever built in US yards on order. They're about 3,500 TEU in size. And they are still having some of order that's going to be delivered. I think it's both 26 and 27. So having US yards build 20 container ships in the next 4 years, that is absolutely not going to happen. Could CMA order a couple or 3 or 4 to be delivered in 4 years? That might be likely. But again, these are not going to be mega-sized vessels. They're going to be relatively small.
It's interesting that we're going to be increasing the order of new vessels because we've already been talking about overcapacity that's kind of impending in our space, but
you can say with the millions of TEU currently on order, having a few or a handful of 3,000 TEU vessels, it's not going to move the needle on overcapacity at all.
Yeah, that's a fair point. Yeah, these vessels are much smaller than what you're seeing going into the major ports in the U.S. I was also going to ask you about the process of reflagging a vessel. You mentioned that earlier. What does that entail?
You can say, I don't have any practical experience in reflagging a vessel, so there might be some administrative snacks I'm simply completely unaware of. But in principle, it's simply a matter of looking at what are the rules and regulations for each and every individual flag. This is something carriers are extremely adept at, also tankers and bulkers, because every single country have different unique quirks. Water manning requirements, like for US flag, you need to have the US mariners, for example. US flags, the vessels have basically to be operated by a US entity. In the case of CMA, that's APL. In the case of Maersk, they have Maersk Line Limited that these ships operate under. And also, that tends to also mean these national-based companies tend to be subject to the nation's laws of taxation. And here it becomes interesting, because for most of the large flag states, you got a tonnage tax, which means that the shipping line just pays a flat fee per basically ton of vessel they operate, no matter how much money they make. This means that in years where they are making fantastic profits, their tax rate is extremely low. During the pandemic, some of the carriers had an effective tax rate of around 1%, for example. But it also means that in years where the carriers are loss-making, they are still paying millions of dollars in tax. So even though they're loss-making, they're still paying tax. So there are ups and downs. But it is a major competitive element amongst nations. Do you have the tonnage tax? And if you look at most of the large flag states, they have tonnage tax. The US does not have tonnage tax. So by flagging some ships into the US and operating them out of US entities, you're going to pay a lot more in tax, which of course again raises cost. And then it all boils down to the same as with USTR. Who's going to bear that cost? At the end of the day, this is extremely simple. The U.S. importers and exporters.
I think in this episode we've talked a lot about the other side of surcharges. Shippers experience that, on a very regular basis, but we're seeing like a different perspective why they might be coming about and how the carriers feel as they're trying to navigate managing the expenses of operating and owning vessels. So it's kind of interesting.
But you would also say, this is going to sound extremely harsh, but I don't think we should cry for the carriers in this respect. Because if we look over the last 5 years, there's one thing we have learned, and the carriers have also learned. If there are major congestion issues, that results in capacity shortages, that results in increasing freight rates, because if there are more boxes to be loaded than there are spaces on board the ship, that simply increases prices. It's supply and demand, and we have seen it both with the pandemic and then with the Red Sea. If, and I really hope that's an if, we get something like USTR and we get congestion, I do not expect it's the carriers that's going to bear the brunt of this cost. That's going to be passed through again, and to the degree it creates more congestion. This sounds cynical, but again, learning from the Red Sea, learning from the pandemic, this plays in the carrier's favor. So if anyone should be up in arms around these proposals, it should actually be the U.S. Importers and exporters.
Yeah, and some of the advice that you gave on previous episodes and something you also mentioned at your closing talk at TPM is that if you feel a type of way about all of these proposed new laws, you should definitely be reaching out to your congressional representatives so that you can have a say in what's going on. Especially being from the industry, you've got a perspective and it'll affect you more acutely than it might for other people. So definitely reach out to your representatives if you would like to speak up and provide your perspective.
Yeah, and for those that think, oh my God, this sounds hopeless, and is anybody actually going to listen? Let's go back to where we started this podcast and the other uncertainty on the tariffs. I mean, when you look at the tariffs, it certainly appears clear that at least some U.S. industries do have a way of swaying policy, because when tariffs were then implemented on Canada and Mexico, who were the first ones to then get exemptions? That was the auto industry. Don't tell me that happened without the auto industry doing an active job and then saying, well, how is this going to affect us? How is this going to affect jobs in the U.S.? So I think there is a genuine opportunity, in this case also for shippers and exporters, to have their voice heard and hopefully shape what this legislation is then ultimately going to look like.
Yeah. All right, everyone. I think we're going to call that a wrap on today's episode. Thank you so much for tuning in live if you're here with us. And if you're listening online, thank you for your support. We're going to be doing our next live podcast next week, so that would be Monday, March 17th at 9 a.m. Eastern. Hopefully, Lars, you'll be in a more advantageous location so you're not up in the middle of the night.
I will be home in Copenhagen.
Amazing. On that episode, we're going to be diving a bit deeper into what port congestion actually is. We hear it all the time. What does it actually entail? What's going on when that happens? So we look forward to discussing that further, and make sure you subscribe if you haven't already anywhere where you get your podcasts, and we'll be here every week. So enjoy the rest of your week.
Thanks for listening to Supply Chain Secrets Podcast, presented by Nice Shacks. Be sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast app. Want to be a part of the show? Register to attend a live recording at the link below.